So, Saros recently launched, and it's already becoming one of those games that people are talking about a lot, but not always for the same reason. On the surface, it's a third person action game, fast paced, intense, with a strong focus on shooting and movement. But once you really get into it, it becomes quite clear that this isn't just another action game title. And that makes sense when you look at the studio behind it, Housemarque, the same team that built Returnal and has spent years refining this kind of high intensity system driven gameplay. It's built around being a roguelite progression experience with a mix of bullet hell combat. And this is a very important distinction because a lot of people tend to mix up the genres roguelike and roguelite, and not with a K, but with a T instead. And they're not the same thing. A roguelike is typically very strict. You die and fail a run and you start over. No permanent upgrades, no progression that carries over. It's all about mastering the system from scratch every time. A roguelike, on the other hand, is a bit more forgiving in that sense. You still die, you will restart, but you keep something from the run, such as progression. There's also the possibility of keeping the upgrades and abilities that you gain along the run, things that slowly makes you stronger over time. And Saros leans more into the second category, which is also where it starts to differ from Returnal, because Housemarque clearly hasn't moved away from what worked before, they've evolved it. In Returnal, progression was there, but still relatively limited. In Saros, it's much more pronounced. There is a stronger sense of growth, more permanent upgrades, a more structured feeling of getting better over time, not just as a player, but also as a character. And that makes the experience much more accessible, but it also changes how the repetition feels, because repetition is kind of the point in these type of games. You're meant to go through cycles, learn patterns, improve or adapt to the situation that you find yourself in. But there's also a very particular controversy that comes into play here, and people that have been following this game might have already heard of this, and it is of course the video from IGN. They decided to give this game a 7 out of 10, which on paper isn't a bad score. It's average at best. But the reasoning behind it is what really triggered a reaction from the gaming community. They described the game as feeling repetitive at times, especially across runs, and questioned whether the structure always supported the narrative it was trying to tell. And this is where things escalated. This is the video in question by IGN. Now, I have the subtitles turned on so you can follow along with what the journalist is saying, and I'll just hit play and we can talk about it afterwards.
About combat, more weight is put on your ability to survive in a war of attrition. I respect that approach, but when you have to spend 20 to 30 minutes going through the motions in a level just to get another shot at the boss, the repetition begins to settle in.
And this whole thing made a lot of people push back on this idea, not necessarily because the repetition isn't there, but because they felt like IGN completely misunderstood what kind of game this actually is. Critiquing a game based on the core traits of its genre is just bad journalism, in my opinion. You can absolutely criticize a game for what it doesn't do well, but saying a roguelite is too repetitive is like saying winter is cold or that a racing game has too much striving in it. At that point, you're not really critiquing the game, you're critiquing what it fundamentally is. And this ties directly back into the roguelike versus roguelite discussion. Because if you go into a game like Saros expecting constant novelty, you're probably going to feel that repetition more strongly. But if you understand that repetition is part of its design, part of the learning loop, then it becomes something else. It becomes more progression oriented. And that's really the core of the disagreement. Is repetition really a flaw, or is the system working as intended? What makes Saros interesting is that it tries to sit somewhere in between. It keeps that cyclical structure, but sort of tries to layer it with a more narrative driven experience. You have the dialogue, you have characters, you have a story that unfolds over time, and that's not always easy to combine because the narrative typically pushes forward and becomes the focus in other kinds of games, while roguelite systems loop back, and balancing those two is not a straightforward job. At the same time, the game itself is getting a lot of praise. Combat is being highlighted as one of the strongest aspects. It's fast, it's responsive, it's very precise, the kind of gameplay Housemarque has been refining for years at this point. And visually, it's also doing a lot. A shifting world, there's changing environments, there's a strong atmosphere, and especially with the whole Carcosa setting and these Lovecraft inspired elements. And that adds another layer to the experience because the repetition isn't just mechanical, it's also thematic. The world changes, the reality shifts, you're not fully in control. And for some players, that reinforces the experience. For others, it might create some distance. And then there's the broader conversation around the game, not just about gameplay, but about story, themes, and the interpretation. Some of it has turned into the usual online debates around the narrative direction, what's intentional, what's being read into the game, and what people expect from a PlayStation title like this. But if you take a step back, the overall picture is actually pretty clear. Saros is a very strong game mechanically. It builds directly on Housemarque's DNA, its fast-paced, gameplay-first design, while trying to expand into something that's more narrative-driven. And that combination is exactly what makes it stand out. But it's also an aspect that can be pretty divisive, because the more directions a game tries to balance, the harder it becomes to fully satisfy everyone. So in the end, Saurus isn't failing at what it's trying to do, it's just very clear about what kind of experience it wants to be. And whether that works for you or not depends entirely on how you approach it, but at least if you're going to critique it, it has to be based on how well it executes that vision, not on traits that are fundamentals to the genre itself. Because repetition, structure, or progressions aren't flaws here, they're just part of the design. Now, I hope you enjoyed this video. I wanted to cover this game particularly because it is going around in the gaming community and making a lot of buzz. And on one hand, the positive side, the people are actually finding it very enjoyable, but also because of the more negative side, because of journalists such as IGN who bashes a game based on its fundamental core traits, which doesn't really bode well with me. You can critique a game if you don't like it, but attacking it because of some traits that it has that is a core to the genre that it finds itself in. At this point, you're just nitpicking and finding stuff that you don't like or disagree with. And I don't think journalism should do that. You should critique a game for what it doesn't do well, and you should voice your opinion about those kinds of shortcomings that the game might have. But you might be able to critique other parts of the games as well. Maybe the upgrades you aren't finding satisfying, or the mechanics you aren't really finding that intuitive, or it's too difficult, or other sorts of aspects. But don't criticize a game based on what is the core of it, what is actually representative of a roguelite title like this. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care, everyone.